You're listening to KYRS, Medical Lake in Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 on your FM dial. Coming to you now, it's Long Waves with Gary Krug. And I'd like to say at the beginning of this show that the opinions expressed on this program are solely those of myself and do not necessarily reflect the views of KYRS, its staff, management, or its underwriters. And thank you for joining me today. It's nice to have you with me. Today's show, The Creators of Chaos. I'm going to be continuing with the theme of the great unraveling, the disintegration of real politics, or even the semblance of it, the increasing fragmentation and division of the social, and the open collapse of law on a lot of levels, except apparently in the defense of property and ego, but we'll get into that in a little bit. And then again, through it all, there is the fear of the other, the fear of Islam, the fear of brown people, the fear of immigrants, the fear of terror. Terror, that sums it up. It's all about fear. We must have wars because diplomacy just doesn't work with some people, or so we're led to believe, and this is such a silly bit of nonsense. But on the one hand, it suggests that somehow the powers that be think we're back to Hobbes' state of nature, from the 17th century, that somehow we're back to jungle law, tooth and claw. Life is nasty, brutish, and short. Well, gee, we turn to weapons, we turn to wars, we turn to violence, we turn to lies and coups as a matter of course. And somehow as I was preparing for today's show, I was remembering the words of Lao Tzu in his Tao Te Ching. He wrote, "Good weapons are instruments of fear. All creatures hate them. Therefore, followers of the Tao never use them. The wise man prefers the left. The man of war prefers the right. Weapons are instruments of fear. They are not a wise man's tools. He uses them only when he has no choice. Peace and quiet are dear to his heart, and victory no cause for rejoicing. If you rejoice in victory, then you delight in killing. If you delight in killing, then you cannot fulfill yourself. When many people are being killed, they should be mourned in heartfelt sorrow. This is why victory must be observed like a funeral." So instead of the celebrations of militarism that we see everywhere, we see at ball games, we see in speeches, we see on TV, we see in movies, victory should be observed like a funeral. But then we don't follow the Tao. We follow another Tao, Dow Jones. We follow the evening news. We follow the State of the Union address. And everywhere and always the messages are tainted, false, distorted. I didn't watch the State of the Union address. I did read some excerpts of it. But one bit caught my eye, scanning around, and that was when President Obama made the statement, quote, "We reserve the right to act unilaterally as we have done relentlessly since I took office, while making sure that other nations play by the rules." And the above comments were greeted by applause. But if you stop and think about it, they should have been greeted by laughter, for it's hard to think of a nation that acts with such flagrant disregard of the rules as does the United States. It's really hard to think of one. So if we consider, just a few examples here, I'd like to quote a bit from the Peak Prosperity blog by Chris Martenson. And he's addressing the issue of the U.S. and Ukraine, and the U.S. involvement and the U.S. blame of Russia for virtually everything that's happening in Ukraine, including the resurgence of large-scale fighting in the eastern region, the separatist region, Novorossiysk, which is getting scant reporting in the Western press, but the fighting is quite severe, and it's not going to the Ukrainians' advantage. Ukraine has also announced that it's going to call up some 250,000 soldiers or citizens to train up as soldiers, but it's unlikely that's going to help them much. Anyway, back to Chris Martenson's Peak Prosperity blog. Russia forced to act. Based on the preponderance of evidence, it's clear to me that the West/U.S. deserve the lion's share of the blame for the conflict that now rages with Ukraine and between Russia and the Western world. It was the West that supported the unsavory assortment of thugs, neo-Nazis, and ultranationalists that seized power in a coup from the democratically elected Yanukovych. We can argue all we want about whether he was a good boy or not, but that's irrelevant and plays into the hands of those at the U.S. State Department who would like to deflect attention away from the very non-democratic events shaped behind the scenes by our influence that led to his overthrow. And he goes on to describe the issues that I've talked about on the show before, and observes that the U.S. did the same thing with Saddam. We want to blame Putin for everything. Putin's the bad guy. Putin on the Ritz. Putin's the bad guy. So you deflect away from the real issues at hand. You deflect away from the coup that the U.S. engineered and bragged about in Ukraine. And instead you assassinate the character of the person who is standing in line over there, sort of on the front lines of it all. So that's how this game begins. Let me continue here. I've got my stuff's a little out of order, and that won't do. Anyway, to continue. Quoting again, so ham-handed were those efforts to intervene in Ukraine on the part of the Obama State Department that no less an historically loathsome creature than Henry Kissinger even called the U.S. actions a fatal mistake. Former U.S. Secretary of State Kissinger said, "The danger exists. We can't ignore it." He warned that ignoring this danger any further may result in tragedy. He was speaking to Der Spiegel in Germany. So, even when Kissinger thinks you've got it wrong, when he thinks you've been too reckless in your application of power, you really have gone too far. Really have gone too far. But then we encounter, as Martenson observes, just unadulterated propaganda from sources like Bloomberg, who wrote on December 31st of last year, quote, "President Barack Obama's administration has been working behind the scenes for months to forge a new working relationship with Russia, despite the fact that Russian President Vladimir Putin has shown little interest in repairing relations with Washington or halting his aggression in neighboring Ukraine." Blah, 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 blah. So you get what the piece is doing. The U.S. is reasonable. It's trying to do diplomacy, but Russia's just being a jerk. So that's the assertion. But there's another assertion that Russia has been providing direct military support for the separatists in Ukraine. And there's another assertion that Putin himself is not interested in any of this, right? That Putin's not interested in any of this. So again, we're back to Putin's the bad guy, like Saddam. We're being reasonable, and it's Russia who's causing all the problems. Well, unfortunately, that just really doesn't wash with the facts. It just doesn't wash. We have, for instance, NATO's organization Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who accused Russia of sending tanks and advanced air defense systems and all kinds of heavy weapons to Ukrainian rebels. Russia denied it. We had Secretary General of NATO, we also had John Kerry, the U.S. State Department, saying that Russia has military forces inside Ukraine, and they funneled hundreds of tanks and APCs and other military vehicles, numbering in the thousands, into Ukraine. Where's the evidence? Where's a picture? Where's any credible evidence at all to be presented to the world of this alleged Russian aggression? They just say things. They just make it up. Even a reporter from The Guardian standing at the border said, "I see Russian troops moving across the border." Not even a photograph. Couldn't get out his cell phone to take a picture, for heaven's sake. Right? And think back how the U.S. instantly blamed Russia for the shoot-down of Malaysian Air Flight 17, which Martinson calls another case of the dog that did not bark. Where's the evidence? Where is it? Well, plainly, it's not around. There is no evidence of this. It just doesn't exist. Or the U.S. would have trotted it out on the world stage, or invented some of it, or something like that. I mean, they would have, right? Because that's just how this country works. You've got to trot out your evidence. You remember with Saddam Hussein, we had Colin Powell sitting there with his little vial of powdered sugar saying this much anthrax. And, you know, we had all of the pictures done up by artists who had been told what the labs look like and were drawing pictures. And so it goes. But where's the evidence? There isn't any. And, you know, if the Ukrainian rebels had shot down the jet with a missile, you can't conceal that stuff from the air. You know, with military satellites, even Google's map should have been able to take pictures of this. You would think, and you would think especially after how wrong the U.S. was on the weapons of mass destruction, that it would be a little more cautious. But actually, why should it be? Because that game worked very, very well. People bought it hook, line, and sinker, the weapons of mass destruction, even when they weren't found. And they stuck to the story about why they went in. And even now, something like half of the American people think that weapons of mass destruction were found and it was all justified and blah, blah, blah. So, there are no pictures. And the only reason that there are no pictures is none have been offered is there aren't any. And as Martinson writes, if they did exist, you can be 100% certain they'd be released and replayed over and over again on CNN until everybody and their uncle could distinguish a T-72 tank outline from a Russian-made APC. Russian aggression? Where is it? Yet we have Congress, as I've spoken on the show before about, passing legislation that is tantamount to a declaration of war against Russia. And even Ron Paul said he had some serious problems with this. Quoting Ron Paul now, "These are the kinds of resolutions I have always watched closely in Congress, as what are billed as harmless statements of opinion often lead to sanctions and war. I remember in 1998 arguing strongly against the Iraq Liberation Act because, as I said at the time, I knew it would lead to war. I did not oppose the act because I was an admirer of Saddam Hussein, just as I am not now an admirer of Putin or any foreign political leader, but rather because I knew then that another war against Iraq would not solve the problems and would probably make things worse. We all know what happened next. That was Ron Paul. I mean, this resolution is so dreadful. It actually accuses Russia of invading Ukraine, condemns the Russian violation of Ukrainian sovereignty. Seriously? Again, where are the pictures? You can just say things and not have to present any evidence at all. And, while we're on the subject of sovereignty, as Martinson points out, and I've talked about on the show before, wasn't it a violation of Ukraine's sovereignty for the U.S. to overthrow the democratically elected government as it did last February? Right? I mean, there were tapes of State Department officials conniving with the U.S. ambassador in Ukraine to overthrow the government. We heard U.S. Secretary of State Victoria Nuland bragging that the U.S. spent $5 billion on regime change in Ukraine. $5 billion. And Martinson quite rightly asks, why is that okay? Why? When you have all of these lies and all of these assertions, so-called, without any evidence, and they're patently proved to be untrue, it corrupts the public discourse. If the government is leading a country into war, it should not be over lies. And it shouldn't be over something picayune. It should be over something crucial, important, unavoidable, absolutely unavoidable. Weapons are instruments of fear. They are not a wise man's tools. He uses them only when he has no choice. Yet we plainly have lots and lots of choice. We're just not using it. So let's see. The resolution says that the East Ukrainians who held elections, the elections were fraudulent and illegal. Well, because 90% of them said they wanted autonomy from Ukraine. They wanted local control. They wanted self-determination. That's used to be something the U.S. said it was all about, but we never have really been all about that so much, have we? We just say we are. We tend not to enforce it. Let me think about Vietnam, which I'll get to again in a little bit. The resolution demands withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine, even though, as I've said before, there's no evidence whatsoever there are any Russian forces in Ukraine. I mean, think about it. This is in diplomacy. This is an outrage. This is insane. And then we have the whole series of economic sanctions against Russia. Acts of aggression by the U.S. and all because the U.S. ultimately has its own purpose in mind for Russia, and that's probably a coup, or what we like to call regime change. Oh, here's a joke for you. How come there will never be a coup in Washington, D.C.? Answer: there's no U.S. embassy there. Anyway, the Russians understand precisely what's going on. There was an illegal coup followed by legal elections in one part of the country, but the U.S. doesn't want to go along with that. The Russian foreign minister, Alexander Lukashevich, said, quote, "Both houses of the U.S. Congress have approved the Ukrainian Freedom Support Act." Isn't that a lovely bit of newspeak? Ukrainian Freedom Support Act by bypassing debates and proper voting. The overtly confrontational message of the new law cannot but evoke profound regret. That's the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson. He continues, once again, Washington is leveling baseless, sweeping accusations against Russia and threatening more sanctions. At the same time, it is muddling together the Ukrainian and Syrian conflicts, which the United States has been instrumental in inflating. It even refers to the INF Treaty, although American compliance with it is questionable, to put it mildly. Dear, dear, dear. At the same time, he continues, it promises to Kiev to arm its military operation in Donbass, eastern Ukraine, and openly admits that it intends to use NGOs for an impact on Russia's domestic processes. Okay, so we've got a serious plan to destabilize and weaken Russia. Why? Why? Because they're a competitor economically? Why? We're going to use NGOs, non-government organizations. That would be like the National Endowment for Democracy that I've mentioned on the show before, which was just set up to do things the CIA was no longer allowed by law to do. But it's funded wholly. It's called an NGO, but it's funded, I think almost completely, if not completely, by the U.S. government. And it includes players like John McCain. Okay. Another Russian observer put it this way. Both UN Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, the wife of the Project for the New American Century co-founder and neoconservative advocate for empire, Robert Kagan, and the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Treasury Daniel Glazer told the Foreign Affairs Committee of the U.S. House in May 2014 that the objectives of the U.S. economic sanctions against the Russian Federation was not only to damage the trade ties and business between Russia and the EU, but also to bring about economic instability in Russia, and to create currency instability and inflation. In other words, the U.S. government was targeting the Russian ruble for devaluation and the Russian economy for inflation since at least May 2014. Well, my goodness. So, and did I mention that Biden's son got a job on the board of one of the largest Ukrainian oil firms? Just a little perk, they were kicking back to the mob here to say thanks for taking care of us like that. And apparently it is being reported that the long-term goal is to destroy Russia, to break it up as a political entity. And there are reports that maps of a divided Russia are being circulated by Radio Free Europe. Now that's just wrong and weird. And I don't know how to even talk about that. But think about this. I mean, these kinds of false statements in the public sphere cause all kinds of problems. See, here's the deal. Here's the nut. We learn to be who we are and what we should be through all kinds of social interactions and social messages. The American sociologist George Herbert Mead noted that the self is created by our ongoing implication, our ongoing involvement with social activities, with language, with relationships, with the symbols of culture. Now, TV, news, friends, family, work, all these should have some similarities and consistencies. They should all be using the same rules of truth, the same kind of rules that we expect the news to use. I mean, governments always lie. They always have lied, generally. But the news shouldn't lie. And when it does, it creates contradictions. See, news, friends, family, work, all these spheres, all these things that we interact with, all these should have some similarities and consistencies if a culture is to be coherent, if it's to hang together. There should be very few contradictions in culture. You shouldn't say killing is wrong and yet you kill people. You shouldn't say theft is wrong and then allow bankers to steal. These are contradictions. They make people crazy. And they destroy the language and the very fabric of society. Justice should not be different things. There should be one justice for all. Truth should be the same for the leader and for the citizen. Or what happens? We end up with contradictions. We end up with the culture having to deal with the dissonance of all of these different meanings. Standard taken for granted rules and practices, just what the rules of the game, the habitus, as Bourdieu called it. Taken for granted, standard rules and practices should be reflected, transmitted, amplified, and finally internalized, taken up by people and enacted by them in their lives, employing these as actions based in principles. Yet if parts of the social are systematically distorted through lies and manipulation and fear and threats and so on, then the taken for granted rules unravel. They don't apply. Why should they? Why should you be the only person who's following the rules if nobody else is? Why should you follow the rules if people in high places openly flaunt them? Why? Community operates at the level of taken for granted rules and practices that people share, that empower people, that give people reciprocal rights one to another. Yet we continue to construct a culture and a society that attacks these very communities. The social and political activities of this country are completely alien to community, not just community here, but the community of people globally. And everywhere, always, it's nation, nation, nation. And what does nation mean? Well, in Latin, natio means your race, your kin. So let's put it another way. Race, race, race. Patria, Vaterland. And this is occurring not just here, it occurs in all countries under the influence of neoconservatism. Because neoconservatism as a social and political philosophy depends upon two noble lies, two great national myths that the country is to hew to. And these are the two things which no politician is apostate enough to deny. The great national myths of God and country. God and country. Always the race card. Gott und Reich. Always. And this opens a fissure in society which extreme right-wing groups move into. We could talk about the Privi sector in Ukraine. They're Nazis. They're openly Nazis. They're happy to be Nazis. We could talk about the militias and hate groups in the U.S., Phineas priesthood, so-called, or Christian Identity, or the Ku Klux Klan. These types are always latent. They're always around just under the surface somewhere. And generally they speak only to themselves. But when they do surface and become vocal, it's when the social fabric's threads are starting to tease out and fray, first at the edges and then extending along the same lines, weakening the fabric and finally destroying the whole. That's when we see these extreme right groups. And we see them all over now. We see Pegida in Germany. In fact, the head of Pegida, Mr. Bachmann by name, probably no relation to Michelle, but you never know. We see Pegida rising up, and the title actually means in German, it translates as Patriotic Europeans Against Islamization of Europe, of the West. Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of the Abendlands. Patriotic Europeans, race, blood, patria. Against who? Another race, blood, patria. Their title of their organization, Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of the West. It sounds like a Tea Party sign. Something you'd see one of those clowns at a park waving around the air and talking about how they're not going to have any more baby-killing Muslim presidents. Or it sounds like something that Louis Gohmert would belch forth on the floor of Congress, or something Michelle Bachmann would have said in one of her ramblings, or heaven forfend, it actually sounds like Victoria Jackson. Victoria Jackson, yeah, just a hater. Just a hater, and apparently, I'll use the phrase, attention whore, who will do anything to get attention and go out and say the most outlandish things and do the most outlandish things. It's hard to believe somebody can be as off base as she is and not be doing it on purpose, but I don't want to make this about her. But always the race card, and always the appeal to Gott und Reich, immigration, Muslims, brown people. Ooh. These hate groups, these right-wing groups, grow not because of the truths of their argument, but because they hearken to a form of social cohesion that people are seeing is diminishing. These fabrics, these threads, it seems to be fraying, and people get concerned, and they look around for the ones who will tell them how to feel better, who will tell them what really needs to happen, what can be done. So they have their own version of a social cohesion to replace the one that's being threatened. Race, country, true Americans, echt Deutsche. And nation and race are enemies of community. Nation and race are enemies of community. Entirely different systems of operation. They seek social organization, these right-wing groups. They seek a social organization, a glue through a kind of charismatic link. The leader, the one who stands up and looks regal, the one who delivers the shallow demagoguery that speaks to the fears and concerns of very frightened people. But this charismatic link is a shallow and very temporary kind of bonding of the group. It's characteristic of gangs and bunts and fraternities that are all linked around a charisma about a leader, and hence a charisma about authority and a central ideological position, which, again, is about race. So you need an ideology of race. You need people who admire authority. An amazing number of people admire authority. It's kind of frightening sometimes. They really want an authoritarian person to stomp his feet and bang his fists and tell everybody what to do and how it's going to be, and then by golly, we'd all know. But what happens eventually is these charismatic leaders and these authorities and the ideology end up bureaucratized. They end up creating offices of purity and national security or homeland security. They become bureaucratized and rationalized. And we've seen this happen around the world. We saw it in Nazi Germany. We saw it in Franco's Spain. We saw it in Pinochet's Chile. Something similar happened with the CIA, sort of. I'm not going to make that argument now, but there is a similarity here that you start off with a fraternity of like-thinking people, and people from the right race, and people from the right religion, and people who went to the right schools, and you link around a central ideology and authority, and you go off and do whatever it is you're going to do. This is not a community based on traditional valid norms and habitual patterns of conduct. This is not a community based on a sort of consensus about the good. It's an organization based on a common emotional experience. Commonly, that's a link of fear and hate and adoration for the leader and the leader's ideas. Look at this worship of Ayn Rand. Everybody ought to read Ayn Rand when they're 15 and get it out of their system. But to hold up this authoritarian atheist as a model for America, a model for any place, is insane. It is madness. Again, it's not about her ideas. It's the admiration of the great person. There's probably two ideas in there that Rand Paul really likes, because he likes to give out copies of that book, apparently. But fear, hate, adoration of the leader. And this state based on ethnicity absolutely depends on an enemy. If an enemy's not around, you have to create one. If one doesn't exist, the enemy must be made. And this is precisely what Obama said, though he didn't intend it in the State of the Union. We reserve the right to act unilaterally, as we have done relentlessly since I took office. Create enemies. And of course, ethnic enemies are preferred, because you can rally the blood around a blood battle, a blood feud, as they say down south. And I suppose we could put an ad in the international press, America. North American country seeks antagonist and foe opponent. Ethnic enemies preferred. Serious inquiries only. So, who are our ethnic enemies? Well, traditionally in European history, the ethnic enemy was always Jews. But we've replaced anti-Semitism with Islamophobia. We've replaced anti-Semitism with Islamophobia as the hatred that binds the Bund together. And this fear is cultivated through announcements, through all this tough talk, through breathless reports on Fox News and NBC about the ISIS terror threat and the Al-Qaeda terror threat, and these are our creations. These are our creations either directly or through our bumbling and diplomatic ineptness in who the U.S. decides to back and train. I mean, really, who are we're now going to take, was it 5,000 moderate insurgents and train them for a year in Saudi Arabia and use them to fight our enemies like Syria, like Bashar al-Assad? Really? What am I missing here? I mean, what happened when the U.S. trained the Mujahideen in Afghanistan? Well, two things. One, they created an army that the U.S. had to fight, and we're still fighting. And the other was that they created Al-Qaeda. And then we have al-Nusra, and then we have ISIS. Where did these people come from? Where did they get their training? Where, oh where, oh where? And even events that we're not responsible for that may occur, we can take advantage of them. You know, we can say, oh, look, look what happened in France. Although that's strange. Look at these terrorists. They're everywhere. You have to. And what did France do? It used the event immediately to enact draconian surveillance laws and speech limitations, all in the name of free speech. Right. And when events don't appear, you can always manufacture them, like the U.S. is trying to do with Russia. Or you can perform false flag operations, gin up a couple of not too bright kids, set them up with some fake explosives, and arrest them at the last minute, like the FBI has done more than once. And sometimes you can let operations go for real. Let somebody be killed. Let some things be blown up. False flag operations. And yes, we do run those. And always there are lies. From Vietnam to the present. Lies about wars. Lies about coups in sovereign nations to make them more pliable for U.S. and U.K. corporations. Iran, Chile, Ukraine, Russia's on the list. And we always lie about it. We'll either pretend not to have any involvement, or we'll talk about how we're doing it for democracy, how we had to remove the evil socialist Allende in Chile and replace him with Pinochet, a ruthless military dictator, or how we had to get rid of the communist Mossadegh in Iran and replace him with the Shah Pahlavi, a ruthless military dictator. And we've done the history of Central and South America contains example after example after example. And you can just go around the world and see where we do this and we lie. And it's the lying that is the key bit. Gore Vidal said the U.S. is run by a corporate party with two wings. It's a great show of democracy, but there's really no real politics occurring. Not anymore. We train and equip fighters to do our bidding, and then they have another agenda. We pull coups, we declare wars in the name of peace and justice and democracy. It's another set of laws, another set of lies, and propaganda and nonsense that continue to erode the public sphere. Dmitry Orlov published on his blog, I had some interesting thoughts about this whole process. Quote, "Killing a handful of innocents is, of course, standard procedure. Few real atrocities help to render the conspiracy theory version of events unthinkable for anyone under imperial mind control, because, you see, they are the good guys, and good guys don't do such things. He's talking about us. But the mind control is slipping away, and even some national leaders, such as Turkey's Erdogan, publicly declared that the event in Paris had been staged. Also, similarly, the supposed perpetrators were summarily executed by the police before anyone could find out anything about them. It's become quite clear by now that such events are being cooked up by the same bunch of not terribly creative hacks. And he goes on to raise some concerns about what happened at Boston. And there was some strangeness around the Boston bombings, and a series of odd links to the CIA, by marriage no less. And then we have one witness, at least one, but one prominent witness, killed by the U.S. government, by the FBI and others, while he was being interrogated. Now that's convenient, isn't it just? Or take back to Orlov now. Quote, or take last year's shoot-down of Malaysia's flight MH17 over eastern Ukraine. The Western officials and press instantly blamed, quote, Putin-supported rebels, end quote, with the shoot-down. When the results of the ensuing investigation led to a different conclusion, they were made secret. But now the Russians have a Ukrainian defector in witness protection who has identified the Ukrainian pilot who shot down the airliner. Since the rebels have no air force, an air-to-air missile was an unusual bit of ordnance for the Ukrainians and was clearly loaded up just for the occasion. So we know who, how, and why. The only remaining question is for whom? Bets are the hit was ordered from Washington. This was big news in Russia, but Western media has self-censored the story out of existence, and whenever the topic is mentioned, Putin did it. Score another one for empire. And so it goes. Propaganda and lies continue to undermine social discourse and poison the language of the public sphere. And the mainstream media are worthless. Most people with anything on the ball, all people with anything on the ball, are going to alternative media to find their information, which makes a great deal of sense. That's what I do, but the problem here is that diffusion of media allows people to pick and choose, which is good and bad. And it's the bad part that concerns me, because many people seek media that support beliefs they already have and emotions they already feel. The scared want to have their fears validated and fed, and the morally indignant want more evidence to support their moral indignation. The narratives collapse. What do we say about the world? Where do we have these conversations about what's really going on? How can one speak a true word in a poisoned language? The discourse is tweaked and seeded. There's a distortion of all discussion through the lens of crooked dealing, secrecy, and lies. And meanwhile, these very characteristics of people going out and seeking their own information or not believing any of the official stories leads people to seek out alternate histories and stories, whether it's 9/11 or chemtrails or that woman on YouTube who wants to know why there are rainbows in her sprinkler. What's in the water now? What's bubbling up from the ground now? What are we spraying in the air that causes her garden sprinkler to produce rainbows? Because that just didn't happen 20 years ago. Madness. Madness, madness, madness. And more madness. This in turn promotes a kind of general ignorance of the world, of science, of politics, of history, of pretty much everything. People just assume that whatever they believe is good enough and true enough, that whatever they believe is something they don't have to defend or argue, something they don't have to make a case for. They know what they know, and we all know people like this. I can think of a lot of them just right off the top of my head, but I'm not going to name names. Not when I'm on the air, no sirree, Bob. That's not going to happen. So who validates our truths? Who says this is right? Where do we build the consensus on what the truth actually is? If truth and justice aren't modeled, plainly modeled, if they are not plainly modeled at the highest levels, there is diminishing motivation for people to adhere to it at any level. If justice and truth are not plainly modeled at the highest levels, there is little motivation to adhere to them at the lowest. Theft, distrust, suspicion, hate take root and grow. In turn, these foster the growth of the symbols of the nation-state, Gott und Reich, and thus community dies as a natural force. But, as the German poet Hölderlin noted, danger itself fosters the rescuing source. And so we see community resurgent. We see all around us this almost invisible work to rebuild communities along traditional lines. Communities with no place for ideology and dogma or division and hate. And this is interesting because it's the one place that things work. It's the one place that we have any kind of truth at all, any kind of discourse that isn't completely distorted, that isn't completely destroyed, that isn't so tainted that to speak it burns my tongue sometimes. And this is the problem. So let me just dive back in. This has been the week of Martin Luther King. We celebrated Martin Luther King's birthday on Monday, and here it is Wednesday. So I want to refer to his speech at the Riverside Church in 1967, which is an important speech. I'll read just a few bits from it. He said, "It is this I believe to be the privilege and the burden of all of us who deem ourselves bound by allegiances and loyalties which are broader and deeper than nationalism, which go beyond our nation's self-defined goals and positions. We are called to speak for the weak, for the voiceless, for victims of our nation, and for those it calls enemy. For no document from human hands can make these humans any less our brothers." In 1957, a sensitive American official overseas said it seemed to him that our nation was on the wrong side of a world revolution. It is with such activity in mind that the words of the late John Kennedy come back to haunt us. Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin a shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. A genuine revolution of values means in the final analysis that our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional. Every nation must now develop an overriding loyalty to mankind as a whole in order to preserve the best in their individual societies. This call for a worldwide fellowship that lifts neighborly concern above one's tribe, race, and class and nation is in reality a call for an all-embracing and unconditional love of all men. This oft misunderstood and misinterpreted concept, so readily dismissed by the Nietzsches of the world as a weak and cowardly force, has now become absolutely essential for the survival of man. When I speak of love, I am not speaking of some sentimental and weak response. I am speaking of that force which all of the great religions have seen as the supreme unifying principle of life. Love is somehow the key that unlocks the door which leads to ultimate reality. Not hate, but love. Not division, but unity. Not patria, community. If there is a future for this species, if there is a future for this country in some form or another, it lies there. All empires and all who commit themselves to destruction and power ultimately fall. And they are not remembered fondly. That concludes today's show. I thank you for listening. You can send me comments or ask questions or whatever if you write longwaves at kyrs.org. You can also go to the Facebook page where I will post links to podcasts as well as some of the articles that I use, and sometimes give a little heads up of what I'm going to talk about before I do it. You can also suggest shows or topics you'd like to see. So until next week, I'd like to thank you for joining me, and I'd like to remind you that you are listening to KYRS Medical Lake Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 on your FM dial. Have a great week.